Some stories do not belong to the famous. They belong to the ordinary people who stand at the edges of greatness, who witness it, who are shaped by it, who carry it through their lives in ways that the famous person never knows and can never know, because the famous person is at the center and the ordinary person is at the periphery, and the distance between those two positions is exactly large enough to make certain things impossible. This is one of those stories. It begins in Liverpool in 1963, in a terraced house on a street that looked like every other street in that part of the city: gray pavement, small gardens, the smell of coal smoke and salt wind coming off the Mersey. Robert Marsh was 28 years old. He worked at the docks. He had a wife named Dorothy and a daughter named Claire who was 3 years old and had just learned to say her own name. Clearly enough that strangers could understand it. His life was the life of a man who had not yet become anything in particular and was not especially troubled by that fact. He had work, he had people who needed him. He had the pub on Friday evenings and the football results on Saturday afternoons, and the particular modest contentment of someone for whom the world was neither too large nor too small. And then on a February evening in 1963, Robert turned on the radio. What came out of the speaker was a sound he had not heard before. Not entirely new, there were elements of the American rock and roll he had caught on Radio Luxembourg late at night. There was the skiffle music he had heard in Liverpool clubs. There were things he recognized as components. But the combination was different. The energy was different. The voice was different, particularly the voice, the one that cut through everything else, rough and certain, and somehow simultaneously distant and intimate. The voice of someone who was not performing at you, but speaking directly to you, and did not especially care whether you were ready for it. He sat down on the kitchen chair and listened to the whole song. Then he sat there for a moment after it ended, in the particular silence that follows music that has done something to you, and then he got up and turned the radio back up in case they said who it was. They said it was the Beatles. He filed that name away and went back to his evening. But something had shifted, something small and difficult to name. The way a picture hung slightly wrong shifts when someone straightens it, the world rearranging itself fractionally around a new fact. Robert Marsh had found his music. He had not known he was looking for it, but now that he had found it, the absence of it before seemed obvious in retrospect. The Beatles moved through the world like a force of nature in the years that followed, and Robert moved with them, not physically, not in any way that showed on the outside, but internally in the private geography of a man who has found something that organizes the rest of his experience around it. He bought every record. He read every interview. He followed the touring schedule in the newspapers, even though he had no means and no real expectation of ever attending a concert. The tickets sold out in minutes. The venues were hours away. There was a wife and a daughter, and the dock work that started at 6 in the morning regardless of what had happened the night before. But he tracked it all with the careful attention of someone who knows that certain things in the world are significant even when they are not directly accessible. He knew John Lennon's voice the way he knew the voices of his own family, well enough to hear what was beneath it, well enough to know when something had changed, well enough to feel the shift in 1965 and 1966 when the music began to move inward, and the lyrics became strange and questioning, and the simple pleasures of She Loves You gave way to something more difficult and more essential. He heard In My Life in 1965 and sat in his kitchen again in the same way he had sat there in 1963, absolutely still, not wanting to move in case the stillness was part of what made the music work. The song was about memory and loss and the specific weight of places that have become important through the people who inhabited them. Robert was 30 years old. He had places like that. He had not known until that song that those places were the kind of thing you could put into music without it becoming sentimental or false. He heard Strawberry Fields Forever in 1967 and could not have told you what it meant exactly, but knew that it meant something, that the not knowing was not a deficiency in him, but part of the design, part of the way the song worked, that it was asking him to sit with uncertainty rather than resolve it, which was a new thing for music to ask. He heard Imagine in 1971 and played it on the record player in the front room, until Dorothy came and said gently that she had heard it enough for one evening. And he looked up at her and said sorry and meant it, but also did not quite mean it, because he had not yet heard it enough, and the part of him that knew this was a different part from the part that apologized, and the two parts could coexist without difficulty. All of this was private, none of it showed. Robert went to the docks and came home and sat at the table with Dorothy and Claire and later with Claire's younger brother Thomas and ate his dinner and watched the television and was, by all visible measures, an ordinary man living an ordinary life in Liverpool. But somewhere inside that ordinary life, John Lennon's music was happening continuously, privately, doing the work that music does when it has found the right person and is allowed to do what it is actually for. And somewhere inside that private life, Robert was carrying something he had not yet found a way to say out loud. The Beatles ended. John went to New York. The records kept coming and Robert kept buying them, and the distance between the dockside life in Liverpool and the Dakota apartment in Manhattan was so enormous as to be almost abstract, two worlds that could be mapped on the same globe but that had almost nothing else in common. And yet Robert Marsh felt, in the particular irrational way that devoted listeners sometimes feel about the artists whose work has shaped them, that there was something between him and John Lennon that was not nothing. Not friendship, he was not confused about that, not acquaintance, not any relationship that had an existing name, but something. The specific thing that exists when a person's voice has been present in your life, through its best and worst moments, for long enough to become part of the furniture of your interior world. When you have heard someone speak their truest things into a microphone and those truest things have met your own truest things and recognized each other. He wanted to say thank you, that was all. No elaborate ambition, no desire for more than the single, brief, direct transmission of a gratitude that had been accumulating for almost 3 decades without outlet. He simply wanted to stand in front of the man and say, "Your music mattered to my life in ways I cannot fully articulate but will try briefly, if you will give me a moment." He had felt this for years and done nothing because there was no available mechanism for doing something, no address to write to that seemed likely to produce a reply, no concert to attend because John had stopped touring, no proximity of any kind to exploit. And then in November 1980, Double Fantasy was released. The reviews mentioned that John was giving interviews again, that he was out in New York talking to journalists, walking in the neighborhood. That he and Yoko came and went from the Dakota, which was not a fortress but simply a building on Central Park West where famous and non-famous people moved in and out through the same entrance. Robert read this. He sat with it for 2 days, and then he told Dorothy he was going to New York. Dorothy looked at him across the kitchen table. She was 55 years old and had been married to Robert for 30 years and knew him in the way that 30 years of close proximity produces, completely and with very few illusions. She looked at him and said, "How long?" He said he did not know. He said it depended on whether he managed to speak to John. He said he had enough in the savings account. He said it was something he needed to do before it was too late, though he could not have explained exactly what he meant by too late or why he felt its imminence so distinctly. Dorothy was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Take your good coat." He was on the plane 2 days later. The Dakota building stands at 72nd Street in Central Park West in Manhattan, its Gothic limestone facade rising above the treeline of the park with the authority of something that has been in one place long enough to have become part of the landscape. People who live in New York walk past it without looking up. People who do not live in New York and who have a reason to be there stop and look. Robert stopped and looked for a long time on the morning he arrived. He had come straight from the airport. His coat, the good one Dorothy had told him to bring, was slightly too warm for the early December weather, which was cold but not the cold he had been expecting. He had a small bag. He had a piece of paper in his coat pocket on which he had written, in careful block letters, the things he wanted. Say, not a speech, not a demand for time, just the sentences he had assembled over 2 days on the plane and in the taxi and standing outside the building, the sentences that would take perhaps 2 minutes to speak if John were to stop and listen. He stood on the pavement across the street from the Dakota entrance and watched. People came and went, a woman with a dog, a delivery man, a family with suitcases arriving at the building next door, a man in a dark coat who was not John. Several people who were not John. The December light came and went behind the clouds and the cold deepened toward afternoon and Robert stood there and watched the entrance and waited. He did not know what he was going to say when the moment came. He had the piece of paper, but he knew, in the part of himself that was honest about these things, that when the moment actually came he would not read from the paper. He would say what came out, which might be nothing like what was on the paper. which might be almost nothing at all, just his name offered and a handshake and a thank you spoken into a moment that lasted less than a second and then was over. He was prepared to accept that. It would be enough. The first day, John did not appear. Robert waited from 9 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. He ate a sandwich from a cart on the corner. He walked around the block twice and returned to his position on the pavement. He watched the entrance with the patient attention of someone who has decided to wait and minds it. Nothing. He went back to the cheap hotel on the west side where he was staying and ate dinner alone and called Dorothy and said it had not happened yet, and she said that was all right, and he said he would try again tomorrow, and she said of course he would. The second day was the same, the third, the fourth. He had been in New York for 4 days, standing on a pavement in December for 8 hours at a stretch, eating sandwiches from the corner cart, calling Dorothy every evening. On the fourth day, another man joined him on the pavement. This man also watched the Dakota entrance. He also waited. He also had something in his coat pocket. But the something he was carrying was not a piece of paper with sentences written in block letters, and the look on his face, which Robert noticed but did not understand, because the look was outside the range of what Robert's life had given him occasion to recognize, was not the look of gratitude. Robert did not know the man's name. He would learn it later, the way the whole world learned it. In the worst possible way. They stood perhaps 15 feet apart on that pavement. Through the fourth and fifth day, 2 men waiting for the same person with entirely different things in their coat pockets, and they did not speak. Robert nodded once. The man did not respond. Robert looked away and went back to watching the entrance. On the morning of December 8, 1980, Robert's flight home was at 2 in the afternoon. He had decided, with the pragmatic acceptance of someone who knows when a thing is not going to happen the way he imagined it, that he would spend the morning at the entrance one more time and then take a taxi to JFK and go home to Dorothy and Liverpool and the life that had been waiting for him throughout. He had not spoken to John. He would not speak to John. The gratitude that had accumulated for 30 years would have to find its home in the music itself, which was perhaps where it had always lived anyway. He arrived at the Dakota at 9 in the morning. He stood in his usual position. The morning was gray and cold, the park across the street bare-limbed and dormant in the way of December. At 11 o'clock he picked up his bag. He took the piece of paper from his coat pocket and looked at it, the block letters, the 2 minutes of sentences, the 30 years compressed into a few lines. He folded it twice and put it back in his pocket. He picked up his bag. He took one last look at the Dakota entrance, and then he walked to the corner, raised his hand for a taxi, and did not look back. He was on the plane by 2 o'clock. He was over the Atlantic by 3. He was asleep in his seat, the exhausted, boneless sleep of someone who has been standing on a pavement for 5 days when it happened. He landed in Liverpool the following morning, and Dorothy was at the airport, which was not something she normally did, and he knew from the way she was standing, the specific posture of a person who is preparing to deliver news before he reached her. She told him. He stood in the arrivals hall of Liverpool Airport with his bag at his feet and Dorothy's hand on his arm, and the noise of the airport continuing around them, and he said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I was just there." She said, "I know." He said, "I left at 11. She said nothing. She held his arm more tightly. He said, "I had the paper in my pocket the whole time." Robert Marsh went home. He went back to the docks and then a few years later retired from them. Claire married and had children. Thomas moved to Manchester. Dorothy remained. Dorothy, steady, present, the person who had told him to take his good coat and had been right in the way that she was usually right about things. He did not speak publicly about those 5 days in New York for many years. It was not a story he felt was his to tell exactly. It belonged to an event so enormous and so public that his small private periphery of it seemed too slight to matter. He had been standing on a pavement. He had not spoken to anyone. He had caught a flight home. Nothing had happened to him, except that everything had happened to him, just not in the way he had planned. He kept the piece of paper, the one with the block letters, the 2 minutes of sentences, the 30 years of gratitude that had never been delivered. It lived in the inside pocket of the good coat, Dorothy's suggestion, as much as his own keeping, and stayed there through the years that followed, through all the times he heard "In My Life" on the radio, and sat still in the way he had always sat still when John Lennon's voice was coming through a speaker, through all the times he heard "Imagine" and felt the same thing he had felt in 1971 in the front room with the record player. The music did not stop when the man who made it was gone. Robert had known in some formless way that this would be true, had known it in the same way he had known, standing outside the Dakota on December 8th at 11 in the morning with his bag in his hand, that he could go. That the gratitude he had been carrying for 30 years had somewhere to live other than in a 2-minute conversation on a New York pavement. It lived in the listening. It always had. John Lennon never knew that Robert Marsh existed. Never knew that a worker from Liverpool had stood on a pavement outside his building for 5 December days with a folded piece of paper in his coat pocket. Never knew that the music had done, in one ordinary life, exactly what it was made to do, had moved through a kitchen on a February evening in 1963 and found someone sitting still in its path and changed, without announcement or fanfare, the interior landscape of that person's life. That is what music does when it is real. It does not need the maker to know. It does not need the listener to be famous or articulate or in possession of the right words. It only needs to find someone sitting still in its path, and the path is very long, and there are many people sitting in it, and most of them are ordinary, and the ordinary ones are the ones the music was actually for. Robert Marsh was the music's purpose. John Lennon was its maker. They never met, but for 5 December days in 1980, they stood 15 blocks and a lifetime apart in the same cold city under the same gray sky, and something passed between them that did not require proximity to be real. The piece of paper is still in the coat. What do we owe the voices that have shaped us? And what happens when the time to say so runs out before the words can be delivered? Robert Marsh has an answer. It is not the one he went to New York to find, but it is true, and it has kept him company for 40 years, and it goes like this. The gratitude does not require delivery to be real. The music does not require your thanks to have mattered. Some things are complete without the conversation that would have completed them. Some things are already enough.